All right, welcome everybody. We're excited to welcome you to this Google Hangout on Air, where we're talking with Jim Groom from the University of Mary Washington. This is being broadcast live right now at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, and it will be recorded on YouTube thereafter. So if there are other people that you know, maybe in your school districts, that you'd like to watch this, I'll be sending out the link afterwards, and it'll be posted to the course website so that you can watch it later or they can watch it later as well. Um, just a couple of kind of housekeeping items before we get started. So this is meant to be a conversation. So if you have questions, feel free to use the question box on the right side to ask your questions. And there might be a little bit of a lag depending upon when you started viewing the live session. So if you ask a question and you're wondering if we see it, we will, but it normally means that we'll see it maybe a couple minutes after you submit it. So we will answer any questions that come in, but then I'll also be asking some questions. So I'm very excited to be able to chat with Jim Groom today. So Jim Groom is the director of the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies and an adjunct professor at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, USA. He is perhaps most well known in the area of open education for his digital storytelling course, the open radio station / online community experiment known as DS-106, and the Domain of One's Own project. He's spoken in a number of venues on issues related to open education, including TEDx New York and South by Southwest, and has also been a keynote speaker at the International Open Education Conference. Just on a personal note, I'm really excited to welcome Jim Groom because whenever I hear him speak, he has such a passion for open education and such a passion for some of these notions of digital citizenship and what it means to be a meaningful participant on the web, that whenever I hear him talk, I get excited about open education, and I'm really excited for some of our teachers that are participating to hear that as well, and to have some of the questions they may have about digital citizenship answered. So I'm excited to get some of my questions answered, but also to hear some of your questions. So without further ado, welcome Jim Groom. Thank you for being with us. And I believe, as we chatted before, you said that you had prepared a little bit beforehand. You wanted to maybe kick it off with a little intro. So just take it away.
Thanks, Royce. And thanks a lot for having me here. I appreciate it. And I was actually thinking before we got on, I was looking over the stuff you'd sent, and I was looking at your site, and I was thinking, digital citizenship is a term that gets thrown out a lot, is used a lot, and I use it a lot. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what exactly do I mean about it? And not only the notion of the digital qualifier, but what about the kind of, the analog notion of digital in quote-unquote real life that we live within, and how do we understand it? So I took some time, a few hours before this started, and I started thinking about it. And, citizenship amount of rights, right? Provides us with the right to work, the right to travel freely from our country and then come back, the right to own property in some context, right? And it's very culturally specific, which is important about this question of citizenship. And it also is very interesting because it defines our relationship to identity. A lot of times we associate with who we are based on a national reality, right? So give you an example of notions of identity. I'm going to share my screen for a second. When I show you a map, right? You'll see the map and you'll see Romanians, Turkish, right? Italians. So not only is this a place on a map that we can kind of identify, but it also kind of invokes a notion of culture, a notion of identity, all the stereotypes that come with both those things, right? It's a complicated notion of who we are, of questions of identity. And it's interesting to think about how that maps digitally, right? So if I bring up another map that you've probably seen online, here's one of the kind of digital map of social services like Twitter, Google, Facebook. I started thinking about how much the notion of digital citizenship kind of maps on some of our kind of traditional notions of citizenship as it relates to nation states and relations to who we are, but there's this whole vast space in there that we don't really account for. And if we think about citizenship in relationship to ideas of what we control and who we are and what is the relationship we have between places that we live. So for example, I'm a citizen of America. I should vote, right? I have to register for the selective services at 18. There's certain things I have to pay taxes I have to do. But in this kind of digital space of citizenship, whether we become a user on Facebook or on Google or on Twitter, we actually also sign into this kind of relationship with these services, right? And, Facebook is 1.23 billion users. That's as big a space and active participants as China. And it starts to think like, what is our relationship when we talk about digital citizenships to these services that we kind of express ourselves into, whether you do it on Twitter, whether you do it in Facebook, on Google, through Google Mail, like what is our relationship? And this idea started to kind of strike me as when we sign up for a service and when we agree to terms of services, we're agreeing to a relationship and a contract. But in many ways in the digital space, we're I would argue, stateless, right? It's not like we have a digital identity confirmed through any federal government as a U.S. citizen. It's not like my identity digitally is at all tied to my nationality unless I understand it as such and define it as such. More so than not, it's associated with these services I belong to and use, like Facebook or Twitter. And one of the things that we're getting at, and I'm trying to push towards here, is how do we understand more broadly what we're getting into when we're getting into those contracts? So let me give you an example of something that I saw thanks to Ken Lane recently, and I found really interesting. There's a site online called Terms of Service Didn't Read. And it's actually a site that breaks down all the different terms of services that you enter into when you get a YouTube account or when you get Google or SoundCloud or Delicious or whatever. And it's interesting if you're a teacher to kind of look through some of these kind of details. Like Google keeps your searches and other identifiable user information for an undefined period of time. Google can share your personal information with other parties. Google may stop providing services to you at any time. And it actually breaks down what is the relationship and contract between you and this digital kind of state of Google. And it would be an interesting exercise for teachers to go through and think about when they ask a student to get a Google account or a Delicious account or a YouTube account, what is actually the negotiation for their notion of identity and for who they are online in relationship to what is kind of almost a bad sci-fi dystopian movie, right? Like the corporate state in digital space kind of defining who we are at every turn. Well, it kind of came in different ways. It kind of came in ways that we didn't expect it, through all these different third-party services that we use to define ourselves, but in the end are using us to define themselves by selling our personal information. So there's a really interesting kind of twist on that. So one of the things that we've been working at Mary Washington is thinking critically about what this idea of citizenship means in relationship to the digital. And the site I just showed you, Terms of Service Didn't Read, gets at, I think, probably one of the most important frontiers for thinking about civil rights as we move forward in the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's who controls our data, how we understand our notions of privacy and freedom, and what is the role of maybe not the federal government, although I invoke that when we talk about national notions of state and identity, but of education institutions to start helping students think through these questions and start helping them interrogate the digital spaces within which we exist. And so when I think about digital citizenship, I think about the role of an educational institution to kind of take the lead and show students what is their relationship and where do they stand. Are they a customer of Google or of Facebook? Or, as we all know, are they the product that Google or Facebook is selling, right? And they're advertising companies. You are what they advertise. You are what people sell or buy to kind of get information about, data about. So it's subtle, but it's an important difference. So at Mary Washington, we've started thinking about this. In fact, we didn't just start yesterday. We started back in 2006. I work as part of an instructional technology group. What we do is we introduce faculty and teachers to thinking critically about how to use various tools in the classroom. And one of the tools we started using back in 2006 was basically a web hosting with a domain. It was basically us defining our own identity through a domain online, that we could take open source applications like WordPress, we could install them in that domain, and we could actually start identifying ourselves. Now, there's a kind of subtle notion here of we're not necessarily defined by a Facebook or a Twitter or a Google. We actually are defining our own space with kind of software that we can control and database information that we define who gets and who sees. And so there's a different notion of independence in relationship to that kind of setup. And so with that notion of independence and citizenship, we started building applications for our community, like UMW Blogs, which was a WordPress installation that had multiple sites on it, and 10,000 people were using that to run classes, to share information. And from there, we started thinking, what would happen if we gave every student and faculty their own domain and their own web host? Not necessarily so that they would be in their basement drinking Mountain Dews, becoming server hacks with green screens. We weren't so worried about that. We were worried about having them think about what it would mean to get a space, to understand how the web works, and to get a sense of like what a database is, what a name server is, what a subdomain is, and how that relates to the data that they share, and what would it mean for them to take some control of that data. So over the last, I would say, about 10 years at Mary Washington, we've moved from giving, say, the technical experts their own domain and web hosting to giving an entire community their own domain and web hosting. And the idea there is, within that exchange of giving this person or giving a person their own domain and web hosting comes along with it an education about how the web works. And thinkly about what is your relationship to the content you produce. How does that help you understand content produced in other spaces? And how does that make you somewhat a more critical producer, creator, and citizen, in that word, of the web? And the citizen in this term, in my mind, is not necessarily stateless, right? It's not necessarily like I'm tying myself to Yahoo or to Twitter or to Google. I'm owning and maintaining my own work. And I may send it to those spaces, they share it in those spaces, but at the end of the day, I control and manage the content I produce, which has a lot of value in many ways in terms of archiving your work, in terms of services, ultimately deciding that you no longer can be a part of their service. That happened to me with YouTube, where I summarily got kicked off of YouTube for sharing copyrighted work. And I really had no place to address my grievances. It was a unilateral, dictatorial decision by YouTube to kick me off. So it's an interesting question. Went into the space of citizenship, about how you teach good citizenship and what practical steps you can take in your classroom to build a notion of citizenship as it relates specifically to the web. Because more and more, whether you're in K-12 or in your higher ed, the web and teaching how to address the web is unavoidable. And the thing that I've been spending a long time doing is thinking about what's the best ways to do that for faculty and students alike. So there's my little introduction on citizenship, on what I've been doing specifically, why Royce may have even invited me here, and we can open it up to talk about any element of open education, citizenship, or what have you.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for that. You touched on lots of different points that I try to bring up with teachers a lot. I try to bring up with educators a lot. And I said I'd like to maybe just hone in on a little bit at first is I think in our vernacular we have come to the point where we confuse the words free and open. And you see this in the open source software movement, the free software movement versus the open source software movement. You see that people have come to equate no cost, as being open. So people will say all the time, oh, it's Google Docs, it's open source, or it's Facebook, and as you said, it's not, there might be no cost associated with it, but the reason that it's no cost is because they're making their profits from something else, selling your information and so forth. But I think one of the things that you're really talking about, though, is the relationship between openness and control, and being able to control your participation and what that participation looks like. Between, I mean, what does open really mean, and kind of how does that relate to control? How does it relate to cost and some of these other things?
Yeah, I mean, all very good questions. And I'll start with that idea of open in terms of free versus open in terms of open, right? I mean, and I think that's a really good question. And it's one that, I mean, I can understand why people stumble on it, because it took me a while when I was seeing all these different applications and all these exciting Web 2.0 tools from 2005 to 2008 or 9. And it just seemed amazing. And you got the account for free, and you could take delicious bookmarks, and you could feed them into your WordPress blog, or you could take YouTube videos and embed them in your WordPress blog. I was like, wow, the web is extensible. Like, we can use it. But what it took me a while to figure out is the difference between free and open is the difference between, do you control ultimately the work that you put into a system? And to what degree does a system let you control? Now, you can still have an open source system, or you can still have a system that's not open source that will let you get all your data out, let you export it, let you kind of see it, manage it, and they don't even say pay for or sell your stuff to ads. They ultimately could, but that would be considered maybe an open system where you can get your data out, where you can put it in freely, where you can do it seamlessly. But it's not an open source system unless, very specifically, they let you, or you have open access to their code. And you can modify their code, and you kind of have the tools of the trade. So when I download and install a WordPress site, I'm installing it on my own server, and I have access to every bit of code on that application. I can change it, I can customize it to see fit. If I'm using WordPress.com, right, that's an open, free service, but I can't access the code and I can't change it. So at that point, it stops being open source in some ways, although WordPress.com, what runs it is open source. But for that particular service, it's done as a service that I can't modify, I can't change, and the only thing I do is export my work and go. And so there's a subtle difference there, but it's an important one, because the difference is underlined by a certain amount of, can you control your content? And how much control over your content do you have? Which is why the terms of service didn't read site is an interesting one, because it reminds us, like with organizations like Apple, that we have little to no control over so much of our content, even if we buy it, right? Like, there's that whole idea, like, how much control do you really feel like you have of your, let's give for an example of your, why am I forgetting, Amazon videos that you buy online. So I bought a Wire video for $1.99 that's sitting somewhere in Amazon's servers that I don't control. And it's not mine. I can't download it or hack it or make a mashup of it. It's basically still their video. Although that notion of ownership is completely, I would say, denatured in this new space. So the idea of free versus open is a really good question. And I would say if you can't hack it, you don't own it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so I think it's, I'm going to put you back up here because I think it's fascinating. You have all these books over your shoulder here. When I've heard Richard Stallman talk about this distinction between free and open in the past, one of the examples he always gives is an ebook reader, right? So if you buy a book from Amazon, it's on your Kindle, how free are you to distribute that, right? Or how free are you to do with that what you want? So if you purchased a physical copy of a book, you could let someone borrow that, you could cut it up into pieces, you could do lots of different things. As it's moved to online, in many ways, what we see is a restriction of our freedoms as a result of the medium. And I mean, you talked a lot about software like WordPress and those kinds of things, and that's kind of where the idea of open source comes from, and these questions originated. But now we're seeing that also occurring with content, and I think that's where our teachers face it the most. Is the content that they use in their classes. So if I have something in a Pearson published textbook, can I make a photocopy of that? How many photocopies of that can I make? Versus if I have to find something online on a blog, can I use that? How can I use that? And so, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Just the shift to content, and how does this issue of openness relate to content? Is it the same as when we were talking about software?
I mean, and who talked in week 1 or last week? I don't know if it was exactly. I think week 1 was the introduction, but you had David Wiley, who probably speaks to this better than anyone. I mean, he came up with the idea of open content, and he just really, his 4 R's and his whole framework around that is brilliant stuff. How I've approached it, and I act like how I've always approached content is I come to this stuff. I'm a literature major, right? Like, I majored in literature in undergrad. I did at least part of my dissertation as an American lit guy. And, in order to do a critique of your culture and a sustained critique as a literature person, you would quote from Shakespeare's plays, from Faulkner's novels, from Virginia Woolf's novels, from essays. And those bits of quotes would be embedded within a larger critique for you to make a point about, some element of our culture. And as over the last 50 to 60 years, we've become a media-rich culture between images, video, TV shows, you name it, even meme culture now, it's actually become illegal for you to embed your kind of content within a sustained critique of the culture. For example, I'm teaching a class on The Wire. And to take a piece of The Wire without HBO's permission in order to do a critique of a particular episode is, theoretically, if not legally, illegal. And it's insane to think about the fact that we've been, as a culture, denatured from our ability to take pieces of those cultures to critically think about them, because so much of the stuff is defining who we are as a culture. So, I mean, there's this really weird impasse between the legality of stuff like music, video, TV, and images, and the reality of how we as a culture think and share and build. And the perfect example, I think, is not that old, it's only 15 years old, is Napster, right? There was this application that came along, and like Stallman was saying with books, someone finally figured out a way to share digital music seamlessly. And so Napster exploded. People were sharing millions of files. They were their files. Presumably they ripped their CDs and they bought them, and they wanted to share them with someone who just wasn't in the same physical space as them. And what opened up was a huge black hole of copyright and culture that we're still, I think, in some ways in the shadow of. And the question about the notion of the digital, and that's that qualifier to citizenship that I started off with, represents a whole different series of, I think, personal and civic questions about what it means to share. How does a whole industry define the way we share, like it never has before? And how are we letting corporations define the way in which we negotiate these relationships between people? Because, I mean, the fact that it's happening on YouTube, or it's happening important, because we've effectively made these tech companies constables of copyright culture. And they're defining how we share and what we do, even if they're not, suing you. They're doing what YouTube did to me. They're revoking your account, and they're not letting you share anymore. And so it's very interesting that when we moved away from, yes, the print culture to a digital print culture, we've gotten into a place that it's far harder to share the things we're interested in, or I would argue to even provide a sustained critique of them, which is, for me, the real horrifying element of that is you built a complete publishing system that's the web, that's decentered, and that's in some ways, beautifully powerful, and then you've built on top of it, you've grafted on top of it a whole legal and political framework that's preventing people from sharing. And it's one of the great, I think, struggles right now about who we are as a culture. And it's hard to not think that these major monolithic companies are not winning. I mean, think about it. Like, everything's done through Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. Like, the web right now is pretty monochromatic, and it's pretty monolithic. And that's a big question. And one of the things I'm really interested in, this might be an aside, but forgive me, is there's a movement right now that's kind of trying the pendulum, hopefully swinging the other way. And it's a movement that's defined, it calls itself the indie web. A lot of different webs for it, but it's the idea of each individual controlling and managing their own content, becoming their own node on the web. And that's part of what I think is why domain of one's own, which is the thing we're doing at Mary Washington that gives every student and faculty their own space to kind of think and share and own, is important because it tries to resist and not a kind of like, screw you, like we're gonna burn the Bastille. It's not about that. It's about returning the web to the root and the fact that really the only thing that's on the web is the individual. And if you have your own space and you share in that own space and you manage and archive your own work, that's what the web is. Mm-hmm. It's a connection of individuals in this node. And that's what gets me excited about it. And so the indie web for me is a kind of ethos of open that I really subscribe to. Right. It's the idea that we manage and control and build our own spaces. And that's as practical as it gets. Mm-hmm. You have your students building their own spaces, defining their own portfolios, doing it with open source tools, doing it cheaply because it's not expensive. And you actually give them not only an invaluable kind of knowledge and fluency in something they need to know, but I think a really valuable lesson that education is willing and able to lead the way in kind of thinking about how important the web culture is to notions of what we are as a community of learners and how essential it is to kind of maintain a kind of distributed notion of copyright. Because if I'm sharing a little bit of a video on my own site, mm-hmm. and it's not through Google or managed through, maybe I get away with that. Like maybe I can hold on to that. Although if I do it on YouTube, I have this ID content control that automatically determines whether I'm outside my rights. And we haven't even mentioned fair use. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge question. And every educator's been through it, especially now with Google. I mean, with YouTube, you've put up a video that might be, use one bit of a clip of a song to talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne and the red letter, the scarlet letter, and that's down with no contextual distinction about what that video was about and how it was being used.
Right. So this question came through from Bonnie, and whenever we start talking about openness and these kinds of things, the questions always seem to go very quickly to copyright for K-12 teachers, because that seems to be often kind of where they have the most questions. And so the question that Bonnie asks is, you mentioned showing copyright material on YouTube. How is that different than showing a video in the classroom? And I think there are kind of two questions there. One is the technical answer, which you're welcome to answer, but I think the other is the idea of sharing. So how is it different, or is it different? Do you share on YouTube for different reasons or the same reasons that you share in the classroom?
Well, a lot of times what I've been sharing, and thank you for the question, Bonnie, and hopefully I'll answer it to some degree. I mean, a lot of times when I share online, I'm sharing online in context of a class I teach, DS-106, which is an open class, and where we ask students to actually create videos and audio clips, and a lot of times they find, whether it's through SoundCloud or YouTube, that their stuff is flagged for copyright and they have to take it down. And I think that's an invaluable lesson to think about. Like, there is a whole apparatus that controls the way in which we think about sharing, which is really crucial. But they'll find that they upload it to their personal site, they can share it, and they can get away with some of that, which is an interesting lesson too. And I'm not saying I'm a lawyer here. This is not legal advice. But I think part of what we're doing with DS-106 is we're trying to push back against the culture that tells us that, you can't share as part of an educational community. It's like, talk about handcuffs. And if you're part of an educational community, you can only share if you're behind closed doors, like you said with that TV. Sure, I'm showing a video to my class, but there's 15 people in the class and no one cares and no one's going to do the research. We've seen all those VHS tapes for 30 some odd years that said the FBI will come and take away your family and fine you $250,000, and it never stopped anyone from doing anything because it was absolutely impractical to enforce that kind of copyright law. But now it's not impractical anymore. Given the nature of technology, it's completely practical for that copyright law to be enforced, which raises a whole different question about how we revisit our notions as educational institutions, as educators. how we push back about that, how we kind of invoke, which is only a defense, unfortunately, this notion of fair use.
Mm-hmm.
And is it fair use to share bits of clips about a TV show that is talking about, some of our deep cultural problems with the drug war, with terrorism, with how we think about a post 9/11 landscape? I think there's nothing more important. And so, we have to ask ourselves, at what point are we willing to challenge some of what is being taken as a kind of as a given, which brings me back to citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's two basic models of citizenship. There's the liberal individualist citizenship, a kind of a conception of it, where, that's fine, leave me alone, as long as I'm given a certain amount of freedom and I pay my taxes. I don't have to be too politically involved, but I have to have the ability to kind of make money. It's one. And then there's a civic republicanism, and that's this idea that you should be actively involved in shaping the laws in the frame of your country politically. And those are two conceptions, and it's not like America is just one or the other. In the 60s, you could argue that we were, civic Republican, like people were pissed off. They were fighting against the Vietnam War. They were trying to shape who we were as a country. I think in the 90s and the aughts, you could argue it was quite the opposite. Like, we were just kind of hands off. It was a kind of neoliberal government that was deciding that money is what you really wanted, and we saw it with the kind of dot-com boom of the 90s, the late 90s, and even the mortgage crisis of 2008, and the idea that NSA is spying on us, and there's still no political upheaval. The closest we saw to that was what happened at Wall Street, right, with the kind of I'm forgetting the name of it, but I Occupy, right? So there's this kind of interesting notion of where we relate to citizenship when it comes to the web.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in this. I have to thank you, Royce, because as I was preparing for this, I was like, there's a whole space of the details and particulars of citizenship that we teach as K-12 and higher ed that we're not even digging deeply into when we think about the web and what it means to be a citizen of the web and how that relates to notions of nationality, relations to the notion of these kind of third-party services that are defining us through their terms of services, etc.
Yeah. So for our viewers, we're going to have more time in our next interview for talking more specifics about copyright. We'll have a copyright expert at that point in time. But so I want to kind of push on some of these kind of theoretical ideas that Jim's bringing up. So you're talking about what it means to be a citizen, and I think that's a great question. When you look at kind of the open education spectrum, there are lots of people in open education, whatever that may mean. And I think you have some different attitudes or some different perspectives on how open education should operate and the process for that. And I guess kind of my question to you is, when I hear you talk, it often sounds kind of subversive of this monoculture, right? And that's fine, that's great. Do you think do you think everyone in open education has that same type of attitude or should have that same type of attitude?
I definitely don't think necessarily that's a necessity of being an open educator, right? I think there are a lot of people who do this legitimately, like David Wiley has, gotten political inroads. There have been entire states like Utah that have signed up and that have really just made a very powerful difference in saying that we're paying way too much for textbooks. We need to change that. And so some people pick very specific things that they want to go after. David Wiley is a perfect example of this. He went after saying the question that textbooks are way too expensive. We need to solve that. And we need to solve that by having people who are doing this stuff openly come together and share their resources and find a way to kind of make that kind of sustainable. Mm-hmm. That's a completely, I don't think, it's subversive for the publishers because the publishers don't want there to be free books. So I think every element of open potentially could be subversive. And I think just talking about copyright is immediately subversive because it makes us all criminals, right? So we're all subversive when we start talking copyright. And I'm glad that you kind of deflected the copyright legal elements because I'm not pretending to be a lawyer, and I don't come at this as a lawyer. I come at it as an educator. And my idea as an educator is we really can't make progress if we're being told by companies what we can and can't teach contextually to make sense of the culture. I think it's a complete disconnect, and we have to address that. And I'm not saying the way I'm doing it is right, but the way everyone's doing it right now as the status quo is not right. It's wrong.
So I completely agree with you, and I think I think it's interesting kind of how open education has kind of evolved over the past few years. I mean, a good example is the MOOC movement. So these massive open online courses, right? When they first started, the emphasis was really open. We're sharing, we're creating communities, very similar to what you've been talking about. But the shift has been more to emphasizing the massive component, so making it more cost effective to deliver educational content to more people, right? And so, when we talk about different open education movements, whether it's MOOCs or open textbooks, it seems like cost is what is often brought to the forefront. That's the first thing we talk about, and often it's the only thing we talk about. And so I guess my question to you is cost the only thing, and I think the answer is no, but is cost the only reason we should be interested in open education, or is it even the most important reason? If it's not, what are the really main reasons that we should be open educators and teaching digital citizenship to our students?
Yeah, I mean, I can see. Thank you. You set up the softball. Now I'm just gonna kind of. But I mean, so it is a good question. I mean, a lot of the criticism that's come of MOOCs, and MOOCs are a very interesting example. So let's just take that for a second. MOOCs were massive open online courses that in 2008, when George Siemens, Dave Cormier, and Stephen Downes kind of conceptualized that term and experimented with it with their first what was called CCK. I think it was 07 or 08. I think it was 08. And so they built this, thing, and 2,000 learners signed up. And maybe 100 or 200 of them made it through, but it was just, even at the time, not that long ago, like 6 or 7 years ago, it was mind-boggling that 2,000 people signed up for an open course online and took it. Whether to the degree they took it, we don't know. But I think Siemens and Downes and Cormier were always pretty clear with the fact that you take out of it what you get. It's not about finishing. And they kind of had figured out most of the inner workings of the MOOC fairly early. But it's at the point when it jumped to 200,000 at Stanford with the AI class that everything changed. Like the entire model became about changing the workforce, having to hire fewer faculty, having to build in a whole new model of efficiency around the question of massive, because the idea was, man, you could teach 30,000 people with what it took, with the same amount of money and kind of investment that it took to teach 30. And so administrators all over the country were like, wow, like we have to pay attention. And the University of Virginia debacle, when the board was like, we must pay attention to MOOCs, and if we don't, we're going to oust our president, then it became a political cry. And through all those factors coming together, the MOOC took on this really larger-than-life indication that the technology was going to somehow make education more efficient, more distributed, and more possibly quote-unquote effective. Now, after the MOOC hype, we learned that that's probably not the case. All the big players in the MOOC, like Udacity and Coursera, are pretty quickly backpedaling on their promise that this is going to change higher ed more broadly. But what it did do is it actually introduced the idea that online learning has arrived, and it's something that we have to take seriously as institutions. But the idea of that as a cost saver is lost. Because doing online learning, as most people know, and as teachers know who may be watching this, is no cheaper. It's much work, if not more, and it demands that much more attention and creativity to kind of figure out how you bring a distributed community together. So the cost is always, like, the cost saving is always this carrot that's like, shaked out in front of people, when the reality is it's going to be just as if not more, if not more expensive to do an online course well. And you could, I'm not saying people can't scale their courses in some creative ways. They possibly could. But I don't think a souped up LMS, which is what we're seeing with Coursera and edX,
Hmm.
and Udacity is the solution. And many of them have already said that we're just kind of doing it for vocational training, or this is just something that people can get a certificate on. I mean, they're completely backing away from the idea that this is the future of higher ed. I mean, Sebastian Thrun at some point said there's going to be 10 institutions left, right? And Udacity will be one of them. Like,
Yeah.
that's a bold claim, and Audrey Waters had talked about that already. But we're a long way from that. But I think we're all still a little bit in the wake of the MOOC, trying to figure out, well, given that, how do we do online classes in a compelling, interesting, interactive way that finally liberates us a little bit from the systems that have defined it for so long, namely the LMS.
Great. So this is great conversation. I'm really interested in a lot of the topics we brought up. I want to be sure, though, that we give enough time to talking through maybe some of the practical questions that teachers may have in the field, because I think when I talk to educate teachers, K-12 teachers, about MOOCs, for instance, oftentimes they don't know, they haven't even heard of MOOCs. And I guess I want to get to maybe some of the practical benefits of open education for K-12 educators, and then also maybe some of the practical kind of guidance or suggestions that could be given to K-12 educators. So does that make sense?
It totally does. I mean, speaking to the practical, and it's a kind of like where I live with open, because I'm not necessarily a political figure. I don't really care about licenses and open licensing to the degree that other folks do. I'm very interested in how does an open educational experience help students kind of develop a voice, frame their persona, and really start to kind of really develop acumen about the web. And so for me, it's very much pedagogical. It's about an experience. And so let me give you a very specific example. We have a group of students. Last summer, we were doing an internet class, and it was a small summer class of 7 students. And so what we did is we decided as a class that we were going to build, a series of resources that other people could use to learn about the internet. And so as a course, we built a timeline that we decided and we built, and we used this very simple tool called Timeline.js, which is developed by Night Lab, and it's check it out. It's an awesome tool. And that was a resource that we built, and we built it, we shared it online, and we went ahead, we built a database of tech references in movies. And so you're like, okay, so what you're talking about open education is just building resources as a class. And I would say it could be as simple as that. It could be as simple as finding a place to publish a series of resources that as a class you guys work on a project to produce. Mary Washington has done this for almost a decade with UMW blogs, and where the technology made a difference is it allowed it to be that much easier for faculty and students alike to publish to the web, to publish the work they've done, to reflect openly on the work they've done, so that not only the teacher was seeing it, but potentially their peers and people beyond the class were seeing it. So it had just immediate impacts upon how they understood their work. It wasn't being done for one person, it was potentially being done for 30 or for 300 if other people found it and shared it. I mean, we have several examples of, a student who will write a post about a particular work, say a short story. One example is there was a disability writer who wrote the short story and writes all about disability. A student wrote an essay about it, and the writer of the story wrote a kind of review of the student's essay on his own blog. And that's a very simple story, but it's a very powerful story about what that means for voice when you realize that the work you're doing is being published more widely. And it also returns us to this idea of, what's your stake in your own education? To reflect openly on it, to control it and maintain it, and to become a kind of citizen not only of your community at Mary Washington, but maybe a community beyond that. And I always thought that, for me, blogging was my entree point to the open education. It was a place where I could connect with hundreds of other educators, share what I was thinking and doing, and get feedback. And I could build a community there, and it didn't seem fake, it seemed real. And I would share out ideas and do things, and other people would join along. It was that simple act of just publishing openly that, for me, is the essence of open education.
That's great. That's great. I think I worry a little. I think that maybe sometimes, like the K-12 educator, were to listen to this conversation we've had, they might feel a little intimidated hearing about domains and WordPress and open source and these kinds of things. And so I guess for my last question, if you could say anything to the K-12 educators all over the U.S. To get them started moving in the right direction, what would you say to them, or what would be the first steps you think that could get them going in the direction of being an open educator, finding value in open education?
Well, first, I'll not pretend to send anyone in the right direction because I'll probably send you in the wrong direction, and I apologize in advance. But I would say, I mean, I think, frankly, I mean, it depends a lot upon what you want to do individually.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be ranging depending on your subject, depending on the age of your kids, depending on how much you're comfortable with them sharing or not sharing. And that's a case-by-case basis. And I'm not going to sit here and suggest that open for life, for everybody, no matter what. Like, every context demands a very specific and detailed look at what your conditions are. So understanding that, speaking from personal experience, and as personal as it gets,
Mm-hmm.
I regularly share the work I do. And it's like if I'm thinking about something in a class, or if I had a discussion, as I was talking to you earlier, Royce, with a couple of students about an episode of The Wire, and we did it on Google Hangout, that's something that I would contextualize and share. And I would just constantly leave these bits of my thinking and my development as a learner openly, and hoping that that would be the case. This is what the students who were in DS-106 did. I mean, the domain and the blog and the open source, you could get confused with those terms, but it's a very simple concept.
Mm-hmm.
Providing a space where people can openly share and reflect on their learning. Mm-hmm. And that's all. I think that for me, it always goes back to that. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a blog. You can do that in photographs on Flickr. You can do it in videos on YouTube. You could do it in tweets. Right? Like, there's a million other ways that you could do what I'm talking about. My choice tool is the blog. But it's a matter for me of habit, of getting into the habit of sharing, whatever it is you do. And you'll see people who do this like awesomely with like the photos. They'll take a photo a day, and they'll just get themselves into the habit of creating. And it's amazing 30 or 40 or 50 days in, like, how sharp their eye becomes, or how trained they start to become. And I'm not pretending to be a good writer after 7 or 8 years of blogging, or almost 9 now. I'm not. But I do have a voice, I think. And it's a voice that I'm starting to really, it's what helped me present to people. It's probably why I'm talking to you today, is that I stuck with it. And I kept on doing it. And I guess as a teacher, I mean, there's one piece of advice that I could give that I've done is, regardless of how crazy or ridiculous or how hard it was to regularly do this work and share back on what I did, I think it's been invaluable what I've gotten back from it. And that's really, I mean, it's a simple moral of the story that I've learned, but I mean, just share the work you do. And that's open education. Like, it's it. Like, you find a place to share the work you do. It could be photos, it could be video, it could be like, me and my wife are big fans of Ravelry. It could be the stuff you knit. Like, there's a whole amazing educational community around the knitting world, around the cooking world, around the Dungeons and Dragons world, around the Minecraft world. It's not limited to me talking to people about building a timeline, about how you tag a blog post. It's such a rich universe. And I think it's a simple act of stepping over from consuming it to starting to create within it. Just participating back within it. And that's a jump, though. It's a commitment. And based on time and energy and life, that may be harder for some or easier for others. But that's what an open educator is. Like, there's this guy, I don't even know his name, but he's this guy who does these YouTube Minecraft videos. And he is a master of them. My kids watch his videos. They've watched hours of his videos to figure out how to build mods in Minecraft. And he is a master teacher. And it falls outside of many of our kind of radar for what a teacher is. But here's a person who's found a niche, who shares freely, who's probably got millions of kids all over the world who idolize the way in which he explains Minecraft. And I just love that. Like, I love that the web provides us with that. And it kind of breaks us a little bit out of our own sense of what a teacher is and how we all can become better teachers at any given time based on our passions. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's the web's a funny place, right? Like, I mean, everybody has their own experience with it, and I couldn't tell what my web is may look nothing like what your web is. Right? And that's kind of what I like about it. And I think we all have some passion for showing and communicating to other people, and what better model and mode than the web to do it. Great.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for this session, for answering my questions and the question that we had it come in. I've been really enlightened and inspired, so thank you for sharing with us.
Hey, thank you, Royce. I appreciate you having me, and I try not to enlighten and inspire, so I apologize.
Well, we'll go ahead and close on that. And again, anyone just tuning in, this is going to be saved on YouTube, so feel free to share this with other faculty at your schools, and we look forward to seeing you in the course. Thank you. Goodbye.